Sarah's hands trembled so much that the water in her glass threatened to spill onto the embroidered quilt, a family heirloom from her grandmother. The bedroom door closed with a soft click behind Michael, and for the first time since their wedding had been announced 3 months earlier, they were truly alone. The air, perfumed with jasmine floating through the half-open window, seemed thick between them, laden with unspoken expectations. Life sometimes places us on paths we don't choose, but it's our steps that determine the journey, Sarah thought as she observed her now husband, a man she barely knew beyond the formal family meetings. The small Californian town slumbered under the silvery full moonlight, oblivious to the whirlwind of emotions unfolding in that bedroom at the Miller Olive Farm. The wedding preparations had been frantic, a race against time since her parents had sealed the agreement that promised to save her family lands and expand his business interests. Sarah, at 22, had accepted because it was expected. Women of her standing didn't indulge in the luxury of dreaming about romantic love. They married out of duty, convenience, survival. Her brown eyes, habitually downcast in learned modesty, now scanned the room, avoiding meeting Michael's gaze. Michael Davis, 40 years old, watched his young wife with a mixture of curiosity and patience she hadn't expected. Instead of approaching as first-night customs dictated, he sat on the edge of the bed at a respectful distance. "You don't need to be afraid of me," he said with a voice softer than his robust appearance suggested. "We can just talk, if you'd prefer." The distant chirping of crickets crept through the window, accompanying the silence that followed his words. Sarah raised her eyes, surprised by the gentleness she hadn't anticipated. "I don't know what to say," she confessed, her voice sounding small in the spacious room. "Tell me something that no one else knows about you," he suggested, with a smile that softened the lines the sun and years had etched into his face. And so, under the red-tiled roof of the house they now shared, a conversation began that would last until the first ray of sunlight tinged the centuries-old olive groves with gold. They talked about different childhoods, similarly marked by others' expectations, dreams locked away in drawers, fears never confessed until that night. When sleep finally overcame them, Sarah found herself leaning against Michael's shoulder, not remembering when she had allowed such closeness. For the first time in years, she had no nightmares. That night, while the town slept and ancient olive trees whispered old secrets, two strangers united by necessity took their first step on an unexpected path. Neither could imagine that the marriage imposed by circumstances would transform into the freest choice they would ever make. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the wooden blinds, painting golden patterns on the white walls. Sarah woke disoriented, taking a few seconds to remember she was no longer in her maiden bedroom. Michael's side of the bed was empty, but still retained his warmth. The routine of those first weeks established itself with the cautious choreography of two dancers, still unfamiliar with each other's steps. Sarah rose at dawn by habit, prepared breakfast while dew still covered the fields, and Michael left early to supervise work on the farm, returning for lunch when the sun reached its zenith. Conversations during meals were polite but distant, centered on practical matters. Management of the land, necessary repairs to the farm buildings, olive oil orders starting to arrive after years of decline. "How you should get to know my mother better," Michael suggested one afternoon as they shared coffee on the porch, where pots of bright red geraniums contrasted with the immaculate white walls. "She's not as severe as she seems." Sarah nodded, though the idea of spending time with Elizabeth Davis knotted her stomach. The Davis family matriarch had a reputation for being demanding and traditional, and Sarah feared not living up to her expectations. However, her first visit to the main house's kitchen, where Mrs. Davis reigned among earthenware pots and ancestral recipes, proved surprisingly revealing. "The secret to a good apple pie isn't just in the ingredients," explained Mrs. Davis, as her wrinkled but agile hands mixed the spices with rhythmic precision. "It's in the patience and knowing how to listen to the oven," Sarah observed in silence, memorizing each movement. The kitchen, spacious and bright, smelled of cinnamon, nutmeg, and dried herbs hanging in bunches from the ceiling. "My son isn't a man of many words," continued Mrs. Davis, as she rolled out the dough with a skill that spoke of decades of practice. "But he has a heart as big as his stubbornness. Give him time." That afternoon, as she returned to the farmhouse with a basket of fresh apples that Mrs. Davis had insisted on giving her, Sarah reflected on the unexpected ally she'd found in her mother-in-law. The dirt road between century-old olive groves seemed less intimidating under September's intense blue sky. Local traditions dictated that newlyweds should visit all the families in town. Each evening, Sarah and Michael walked the steep streets of the small town, bringing homemade pies and last season's olive oil as offerings. In each white-painted house, Sarah discovered a new facet of Michael. She saw him kneel to speak at eye level with shy children, watched him repair a broken shutter at an elderly widow's home without being asked, heard him precisely recall details from conversations held months before. He was a man who paid attention, who saw people beyond their immediate utility. "How do you remember the names of all Mrs. Johnson's grandchildren?" she asked one night as they returned to the farm under a star-studded sky. "People need to be seen," he responded simply. "It's the least we can offer them." One afternoon, as they walked among the silver-leaved olive trees that had sustained generations of Sarah's family, she dared to ask what had been circling her mind for weeks. "Why did you accept this marriage? You could have chosen any woman in town, someone with more experience, with more what?" Michael paused, his eyes fixed on the horizon where mountains silhouetted against the evening sky. "I don't know. Someone better." Michael turned to look at her, and for the first time Sarah didn't avert her gaze. "At 40, I've learned that beauty lies in what's authentic, not what's perfect," he said. "And you, Sarah Miller, are the most authentic person I've ever met. You don't try to impress anyone. You don't pretend to be who you aren't." The silence that followed was full of meaning, like the space between musical notes that completes the melody. The gentle breeze swayed the olive branches. Silent witnesses to confessions whispered for centuries among their twisted trunks. That night, when Sarah lay down beside Michael, the space between their bodies seemed less an abyss and more a bridge under construction. The crisis arrived like a storm in the California valley. First a sky too blue, then an unsettling silence in the air, and suddenly, chaos. Sarah was reviewing the farm's accounting books when she discovered the truth her father had carefully hidden. The financial situation was much worse than she had imagined. Debts accumulated like black clouds on the horizon. Late payments to suppliers, pending taxes, loans with interest growing like weeds. Reality unfolded before her in columns of red numbers that threatened to swallow the future she was just beginning to imagine. The second blow came soon after. An unexpected drought hit the region, the worst in decades according to the town's elders. The sky, once generous with its spring rains, became an implacable blue canopy that watched pitilessly as the earth cracked under a merciless sun. "The olive trees are suffering," Sarah explained to Michael one afternoon as they walked among rows of centuries-old trees. "If we don't get water soon, we'll lose much of the harvest." Michael observed the silver leaves beginning to curl, an unmistakable sign of water stress. His face reflected concern but also determination. "My grandfather used to say that olive trees are like wise people. They've seen too much to give up at the first obstacle," he replied, running his calloused hand over the twisted trunk of an olive tree that had witnessed empires pass. "We'll find a solution." That night, while the entire town prayed for rain in the small white church on the square, Sarah unearthed the agricultural journal her grandfather had maintained for more than 40 years. The yellowed pages, written in precise calligraphy, contained the accumulated wisdom of generations who had survived droughts, plagues, and wars. "Water doesn't always come from the sky," she read aloud as Michael leaned over her shoulder. "Sometimes it must be sought beneath the earth as one seeks truth with patience and faith." The following weeks became a battle against adversity. Michael negotiated with farmers from neighboring towns to secure more drought-resistant olive varieties. Sarah studied artisanal irrigation techniques that would allow them to use every last drop of water efficiently. Together, they combed the farm inch by inch, looking for forgotten ancient wells that could be reactivated. The work was exhausting. They rose before dawn and returned home long after nightfall, with aching muscles and blistered hands. But during these long days, something began to change between them. They were no longer two strangers fulfilling a duty, but companions on a shared mission. "I never asked what you wanted," Michael said one night as they dined by lamplight, economizing on electricity. "Before all this, before the wedding, what did you dream for your life?" Sarah set her fork aside and reflected. No one had ever asked her that before. "I wanted to teach," she finally confessed. "I like the idea of working with children, showing them how plants grow, how nature's cycles work. But my father said these were inappropriate fantasies for someone with my responsibilities." Michael nodded, as if her answer confirmed something he had suspected. "Dreams don't expire, Sarah. They just change shape." That night, for the first time, Sarah fell asleep thinking not just about surviving the present, but about the possibility of a chosen future, not an imposed one. Meanwhile, Emily, Sarah's best friend since childhood, observed the subtle changes in her with a mixture of joy and silent envy. During her weekly visits, she noticed how Sarah spoke with more confidence, how her posture was no longer permanently tense, how she smiled more often. "You're different," Emily commented one afternoon, as she helped Sarah sort olives for artisanal production. "There's something about you that shines." "It's the sweat from hard work," Sarah joked, but her smile revealed a deeper truth. Emily harbored her own secret. She was in love with a man her family would never approve of, a traveling musician with neither land nor fortune. In Sarah's arranged marriage, which surprisingly seemed to be flourishing, she saw both an inspiration and a painful reminder of what she could not have. As the drought continued, and the financial situation remained precarious, Sarah and Michael learned to find small victories amid adversity. The discovery of an ancient underground irrigation system beneath part of the farm, the successful negotiation of an extension for an important loan, the first early olive harvest that, though reduced, promised exceptional quality oil. Sometimes the deepest roots grow in the driest soil, Mrs. Davis told Sarah as they prepared preserves for winter, because they must fight harder to find what they need. Sarah was beginning to understand that this phrase applied not only to the olive trees struggling against drought, but also to hearts learning to flourish in unexpected terrain. The county fair arrived with its explosion of color, music, and centuries-old traditions. For a week, daily worries were suspended as streets filled with stalls, squares vibrated with the sound of guitars, and the air became impregnated with the aroma of freshly made funnel cakes and warm apple cider. Sarah and Michael attended together, as befitted newlyweds. She wore a red dress that Mrs. Davis had insisted on giving her, arguing that the color would bring good fortune for the coming harvest. He, more elegant than usual in an impeccable white shirt, looked at her with a pride he no longer tried to disguise. It was amid the bustle of the main square, as they watched couples dancing under strings of lights, when it happened. A black-haired woman with a stately bearing approached them with the confidence of someone treading familiar ground. "Michael Davis," she pronounced with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Time has been generous to you." Sarah felt how Michael's hand holding hers tensed imperceptibly. "Jessica," he replied with a forced courtesy, "I didn't know you'd returned." "Just a week ago," explained the woman, whose dark eyes now rested on Sarah with barely disguised curiosity. "San Francisco proved too cold, even after all these years." The introduction was brief and formal. Jessica Winters, a former friend from town. Sarah caught the hesitation on the word friend and felt an unfamiliar sensation settle in her chest. It wasn't simply curiosity, but a sharp unease that felt new and disturbing. During the rest of the evening, Sarah observed Michael with new eyes. She noticed how his gaze occasionally sought Jessica among the crowd, how his laugh sounded slightly different when she approached their group, how a peculiar silence settled between them during the journey back to the farm. The following days brought with them a subtle but undeniable tension. Michael spent more time in the fields, returning late and tired. Sarah immersed herself in administrative work, trying to ignore the questions accumulating in her mind. The space between them, which had begun to narrow, widened again without either knowing how to address it. It was Mrs. Davis who, with the direct wisdom of the elderly, who no longer have time for beating around the bush, addressed the situation one afternoon as Sarah helped her prepare dough for apple pies in the spacious family kitchen. "Jessica Winters was my son's great love in his youth," she said, while her expert hands formed perfect circles of dough, or at least that's what he believed for years. Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the board where she was kneading, trying to make her voice sound casual. "You don't have to tell me that, Mrs. Davis." "Yes, I do," insisted the older woman, stopping her hands to look at her directly. "Because you need to understand that what they had was like fireworks, brilliant, spectacular, and ephemeral. She left him for a San Francisco man with more money and promises of a cosmopolitan life. It devastated him. Sarah raised her eyes, surprised by the frankness. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I see how you look at her, with fear, as if she might take something that belongs to you," responded Mrs. Davis, returning to her task. "And I see how you look at him, with doubts, as if you're not sure of your place in his life." The silence that followed was laden with unexpressed emotions. The aroma of cinnamon and sautéed onions floated in the air as the afternoon sun cast elongated shadows through the windows. "True love isn't born complete, my dear," continued Mrs. Davis with a softer voice. "It's built stone by stone, word by word, choice by choice. And every day since you married my son, I've seen how both of you place another stone in that foundation." Sarah felt tears threatening to overflow, but she contained them. All her life she had learned to hide her emotions, to consider them a weakness that must be controlled. "I don't know how to compete with a memory," she finally confessed. Mrs. Davis smiled, a warm smile that softened the deep wrinkles of her face, weathered by sun and years. "It's not about competing, Sarah, it's about choosing. And my son already chose when he accepted this marriage. Now it depends on you to decide if you trust in that choice." That night, Sarah waited awake until Michael returned from the fields. She heard him wash up in the adjoining bathroom, prepare for bed with the familiar routine she knew so well. The sound of water, teeth brushing, the tired sigh before turning off the light. When he slid under the sheets next to her, Sarah broke the silence. "Who was Jessica to you?" The question hung suspended in the darkness of the room. For a moment, only the distant song of crickets and their held breaths could be heard. "Someone who taught me that all that glitters is not gold," he finally answered, his voice barely a whisper. "And that sometimes we mistake love for its reflection." Sarah turned to look at him in the penumbra, distinguishing only the outline of his profile against the dim light filtering through the window. "Do you still feel something for her?" "I feel gratitude," he replied after a pause. "Because if she hadn't left me, I would never have discovered what it is to build something real. With you." That night, the distance between their bodies shortened a little more, not with unbridled passion, but with the silent intimacy of two people who begin to dismantle brick by brick the walls they've built around themselves over years. The farm was beginning to show signs of recovery, like a patient slowly returning to life after a prolonged illness. The combination of irrigation techniques rescued from ancient manuscripts and new, more resistant olive varieties was starting to bear fruit, literally. Production, though far from its historical splendor, promised stability for the first time in years. It was then that the proposal arrived that would alter the course of everything, an envelope with the letterhead of a company from New York, delivered by the postman on a bright spring morning. Sarah opened it at the kitchen table, with sunlight drawing golden patterns on the worn tile floor. The contents were as tempting as they were disturbing, an offer to buy a substantial part of the farm's land. The sum offered was generous, more than enough to settle all pending debts and guarantee financial stability for years. The investor, a tourism development company, planned to transform the wheat fields and part of the olive groves into vacation home complexes with authentic California flavor. Sarah was rereading the letter when Michael entered the kitchen, his face and hands stained with reddish earth after a morning working in the fields. "Bad news?" he asked, noticing her worried expression as he washed at the stone sink. Sarah wordlessly handed him the letter. She watched him read, saw his eyebrows furrow and his jaw progressively tense. "It's a generous offer," she commented cautiously when he finished reading. Michael laid the letter on the table and looked out the window, toward the fields that extended as far as the eye could see, a mosaic of greens and golds under the intense blue sky. "Generous." His voice contained a barely controlled tension. "They want to convert lands that have fed generations into vacation homes for tourists who will come 2 weeks a year to take selfies with the remaining olive trees." "It would only be part of the farm," Sarah argued, though her heart wasn't fully behind these words. "Enough to settle the debts and have a breather." "A breather?" Michael looked at her directly, his dark eyes lit with a passion Sarah had rarely seen. "What's the use of breathing if you sell your soul to do it?" The discussion that followed was their first real one. Not a tense conversation or a polite disagreement, but an authentic clash of visions. Voices were raised, words came out sharp, doors closed with more force than necessary. For the first time since their marriage, they dined separately. He in the field, supervising night irrigation. She in the silent kitchen, where every sound seemed amplified by his absence. The night brought with it a restless calm. Sarah remained awake, listening to the familiar sounds of the old house, the creaking of wooden beams, the whisper of wind through the branches of the apple tree in the yard, the persistent drip of the faucet they had never completely managed to fix. When Michael finally returned, long after midnight, he sat on the edge of the bed without undressing. The scent of earth and sweat mingled with the fragrance of jasmine climbing the exterior wall. "I'm sorry," he said, the words coming with difficulty. "I shouldn't have spoken to you that way. And I'm sorry for not understanding what these lands mean to you," she responded, sitting up. "It's not just about money or survival, is it?" Michael shook his head, his profile outlined against the silvery moonlight filtering through the window. "When my father fell ill, and I had to leave my studies to take charge of everything, I felt trapped," he confessed. "I spent years resentful, dreaming of escape. But one day during the harvest I saw the same men who had worked with my grandfather, with my father, and now with me, sharing stories as they gathered olives. I saw how they knew each tree by name, how their wrinkled hands treated each fruit with reverence. And I understood that I wasn't trapped in an obligation. I was the guardian of something much greater than myself." Sarah moved to sit beside him, their shoulders almost touching in the penumbra. "You never told me that." "There are many things we still haven't told each other," he replied with a tired smile. "But we have time." The conversation that followed lasted until the first birdsong announced dawn. They talked as never before, about deep fears, almost forgotten hopes, visions for a future that for the first time they truly imagined together. And amid that conversation, as the greyish light of dawn began to outline the contours of the room, Sarah found her voice. "I have an idea," she said, her mind working with sudden clarity. "A way to save the farm without selling a single foot of land." During the following weeks, Sarah unearthed the notebook where she had secretly been developing a plan to produce premium olive oil using traditional methods combined with organic certifications that would allow access to specialized markets. She showed Michael her meticulous calculations, her research on international gastronomic trends, her designs for packaging that would tell the story of the farm. "It's risky," she acknowledged as she spread her notes on the dining room table, where the whole family now gathered, including Mrs. Davis. "We would have to invest almost everything we have, work twice as hard, and even then, it might not work. Or it could change everything," Michael responded, studying the documents with growing attention. "This isn't just a business plan, Sarah. It's a vision." The decision wasn't easy or quick. There were nights of doubts, calculations redone repeatedly by the vacillating light of candles to save electricity. There were passionate arguments from both sides, moments of paralyzing fear before the magnitude of the risk. But finally, on a June morning, Sarah sent a letter formally rejecting the offer from the New York investors. The response came a week later, in the form of an even more generous counteroffer and the veiled warning that they could buy neighboring properties if the Miller-Davis farm wasn't available. Sarah was holding this second letter in the ancient olive grove when Michael found her. The setting sun bathed everything in a golden light, making her brown hair shine like polished amber. "Doubts?" he asked, stopping beside her. Sarah looked around, the olive trees that had seen generations pass, the blue mountains on the horizon, the sky beginning to tinge with pink and orange. Then she looked at Michael, the man who had entered her life out of obligation and now stood there by choice. "Not for a moment," she responded, tearing the letter into small pieces that the wind scattered among the century-old trees. "Some things are priceless." That night, as they dined on bread with homemade jam, the only meal they could afford while investing their last cent in their shared vision, they laughed as they hadn't in months. The simplicity of the food contrasted with the richness of what they were building together. Not just a business, but a legacy, an identity, a consciously chosen future. The transformation had begun, not just for the farm, but for them. Sarah, who had accepted a marriage out of duty, now passionately defended her own vision. Michael, who had sought companionship to mitigate his loneliness, found in his wife not just a companion, but an intellectual and emotional partner. The most important decisions, thought Sarah, as she watched Michael sleep beside her that night, are those that force us to choose between the safe and the true. The sacrifices soon became evident. The path they had chosen demanded more than they had anticipated. More work, more renunciations, more resistance. The farm transformed into a beehive of frenzied activity as they implemented Sarah's ambitious plan. Each morning began before the first ray of sunlight touched the fields. Sarah and Michael worked side by side with the few employees they had been able to keep, many of whom accepted temporary salary reductions in exchange for promises of participation in future profits. The workdays extended well into the night, illuminated by kerosene lamps to economize on electricity. The daily menu simplified to the essentials: vegetable soup in the cool months, corn chowder when it warmed up, homemade bread, fruits and vegetables from the small garden they had expanded. Luxuries were suspended indefinitely. There was no money for new clothes, for repairs that weren't urgent, for celebrations. "I never thought I'd miss something as simple as ice cream in the town square on Sundays," Sarah confessed one particularly hot afternoon, as they sorted early olives for an experimental production. Michael smiled, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "When all this works, I'll buy you the biggest ice cream they've ever seen in this town. I promise." These small moments of complicity, shared humor amid exhaustion, sustained their spirit. The private jokes, the affectionate nicknames that emerged naturally, the looks of mutual recognition when something went according to plan, all of this was weaving an intimacy that transcended the physical. The lunch breaks under the shade of apple trees became sacred rituals. During that hour they talked about everything except work: books they had loved in adolescence, trips they dreamed of taking someday, how it would be to have children running among the olive trees. These conversations, so simple and yet so deep, built bridges between their separate pasts and their joint future. One day, while enjoying that brief respite in the dappled shade of an old apple tree, Sarah dared to formulate a question that had been circling her mind. "If you could go back, would you choose this marriage again?" Michael stopped the piece of bread he was bringing to his mouth and looked at her with an intensity that made Sarah hold her breath. "I wouldn't choose to go back at all," he replied after a moment of reflection, "because that would mean losing everything we've built since then." The response, so different from the romantic declaration she might have secretly hoped for, proved strangely more satisfying. It wasn't an affirmation of idealized love, but a recognition of the value of the shared path, of the reality they had forged together day by day. The first results of the new approach began to materialize gradually. A gourmet shop in San Francisco placed a significant order after tasting their experimental oil. A specialized blog on artisanal products published an enthusiastic review. An award-winning chef from Los Angeles contacted them interested in a collaboration. But with each small victory came new challenges. The old machinery failed at the most critical moments. The regulations for organic certifications proved more complex than anticipated. Local competitors, initially skeptical, now observed the farm's rebirth with growing suspicion. It was during this period of incessant work and cautious hope that Emily appeared at the farm in the middle of the night. Sarah opened the door to find her best friend with eyes red from crying and a small suitcase at her feet. "He's going to marry someone else," were her first words, before collapsing into Sarah's arms. The story emerged between sobs. The musician with whom Emily had fallen in love, the man for whom she had defied her family's wishes, had announced his engagement to the daughter of a Los Angeles music producer. The betrayal was so recent that Emily still carried in her purse tickets to a concert they were supposed to attend that very week. The decision to take her in was immediate and instinctive. There was no need for discussion between Sarah and Michael. The small house that barely accommodated them would have to stretch a little more. "She can stay in the small room next to the kitchen," Michael suggested, already preparing clean sheets. "It's warm but has good ventilation." This third obstacle, the incorporation of a person in full emotional mourning to their already complicated routine, tested the limits of their patience and resources. The house, barely sufficient for two, now housed 3 adults with distinct needs and rhythms. The single bathroom became a logistical exercise. Meals required additional planning. Moments of intimacy became scarcer and more precious. Emily, initially sunk in a melancholy that kept her in bed until midday, seemed a ghostly presence in the house. Her empty eyes, Monosyllabic responses and lack of appetite worried Sarah, who tried to divide her attention between the demands of the farm and caring for her friend. It was Michael who, surprisingly, found the way to connect with Emily. One afternoon, he returned from town with an old guitar he had obtained in exchange for extra work. "My grandfather used to say there's no sadness that can resist three things: work with your hands, a good meal, and shared music," he explained, as he placed the instrument next to Emily, who remained seated in the inner courtyard with a lost gaze. "I don't know how to play, but you do, and there are olives that need to be picked at dawn tomorrow." The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was constant. Emily began to rise with them at dawn. Her hands, more delicate than Sarah's and Michael's, proved surprisingly skilled for tasks that required precision. At night, after simple but satisfying dinners, the three formed a small improvised tertulia in the courtyard under the stars. Emily played American folk melodies on the guitar, Sarah shared stories from her childhood, and Michael occasionally recited verses from local poets he had memorized in his youth. Sarah discovered in herself a capacity she didn't know she possessed, the ability to be a safe harbor for others. She observed how her words of encouragement, her small gestures of care, her attentive listening, created a space where Emily could begin to heal. It was a different kind of strength than what she had needed to face financial crises or difficult farm decisions. It was a gentle but sustained strength, like water that doesn't break the rock in one blow, but patiently models it over time. Michael, for his part, revealed a generosity of spirit that raised even higher the admiration Sarah felt for him. Far from resenting the intrusion into their space and routine, he integrated Emily into the farm projects, finding tasks that took advantage of her specific skills and respected her grieving process. One night, while Emily slept and they shared a moment of privacy in their room, Sarah expressed her gratitude. Not all men would have welcomed a devastated woman they barely know like this. Michael, who was removing his work boots, looked up with an expression that mixed surprise and tenderness. "She's not a stranger, Sarah. She's your chosen family. And now she's part of mine too." That simple declaration crystallized something Sarah had been feeling for weeks. They were building not just a business or a marriage, but a home in the deepest sense of the word. A place where people could arrive wounded and find space to heal, where abundance wasn't measured in possessions, but in human connections. Emily's presence, which initially seemed a complication, transformed into an unexpected catalyst. The three formed an improvised but functional unit. They planted a small vegetable garden with tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants. Together, they painted the rooms of the house with traditional whitewash. They created routines that included night readings and long conversations at the table after meals. And in the midst of this improvised family, between daily sacrifices and small shared joys, the farm and its inhabitants continued their slow but constant metamorphosis. The storm arrived without warning, as the most devastating ones often do. One autumn afternoon, the sky darkened with alarming rapidity. Black clouds, loaded with water and electricity, swirled over the fields like an omen of what was to come. "We need to secure everything," Michael shouted, running toward the shed where they kept the newly acquired machinery with their first profits. "Sarah, take care of the experimental seedlings." The wind began to howl among the century-old olive trees, bending branches and tearing off silver leaves that flew like tiny silver fish in a furious river. The first drop hit the dry ground with an almost metallic sound, soon followed by a downpour that transformed the farm paths into reddish streams within minutes. Sarah ran among the seedlings in the experimental nursery, trying to protect the most delicate varieties with plastic, when the first lightning tore the sky, followed almost immediately by a thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Her body instantly paralyzed, as if an invisible hand had pressed a switch inside her. It wasn't the present storm she was seeing, but another, 20 years ago. Her little brother, Thomas, just 5 years old, trapped in the creek that crossed the property, the water rising with terrifying speed while she, at 7, screamed for help from the bank. The eternal seconds until her father arrived, the desperate struggle against the current, the small and motionless body finally pulled from the water. Thomas had survived, but Sarah never forgot those moments of absolute terror, of certainty that she would forever lose the one she loved most. Since then, violent storms awakened in her a primary visceral fear that adult reason couldn't control. She found herself running toward the house, blind to everything except the desperate need for shelter. She closed her bedroom door and curled up in the corner furthest from the windows, shaking uncontrollably while her breathing accelerated until each inhalation was a painful gasp. The world seemed to close around her, the walls moving closer, the air becoming too dense to enter her lungs. Michael searched for her throughout the farm when he didn't find her at the nursery. Upon reaching the closed bedroom, he didn't try to enter. He sat in the hallway next to the door and began to speak in a calm, steady voice like a beacon in the storm. "I'm here, Sarah," he said, loud enough to be heard through the wood but without shouting. "I won't come in if you don't want me to, but I'm not leaving. The storm will pass soon." He continued talking without expecting a response. He told her banal anecdotes about his day, described how the hens had all taken refuge in a corner of the henhouse, forming an indistinguishable mass of feathers, recited from memory a poem by Robert Frost about the California mountains. "Breathe with me," he suggested at one point. "Inhale counting to 4, hold counting to 4, exhale counting to 6, like that slowly." Sarah, from her corner, began unconsciously to synchronize her breathing with the rhythm he was marking. Little by little, the knot in her chest began to loosen. The walls stopped moving closer. Air began to flow into her lungs again. The storm gradually abated, first the wind, then the rain. Finally, the thunder moved away toward the mountains. But Michael remained there, speaking calmly, his voice an anchor to which Sarah could cling as she navigated back from the territory of panic. When she finally opened the door, hours later, she found him sitting on the hallway floor, his back leaning against the wall, waiting patiently as he had promised. His clothes were still damp, his face showed signs of exhaustion, but his eyes lit up upon seeing her. "I'm sorry," she murmured, embarrassed by what she considered an unforgivable weakness. "I don't know what happened to me." "There's nothing to be sorry about," he replied, getting up with a slight groan from hours of immobility. "We all have inner storms, Sarah. Only the way they hit us changes." That night, for the first time, Sarah told him the complete story of Thomas's accident. She spoke of the terror, of the guilt that had accompanied her for years for not being able to help directly, of the recurring nightmares where she couldn't save those she loved. "I've never told this to anyone," she confessed, as they shared a cup of chamomile tea in the silent kitchen. "My family never spoke of the subject again, as if by not mentioning it, it could disappear." Michael listened attentively, his eyes never leaving hers, his hands occasionally covering hers in the most difficult moments of the story. "Sometimes silences protect us," he finally said, "but other times they lock us in invisible cages." The next day, they went out together to assess the storm's damage. The situation was worrying but not catastrophic. Some broken branches on the oldest olive trees, the experimental nursery partially flooded, a section of the perimeter fence knocked down. But as they traversed the muddy fields under a once again blue sky, Sarah felt a subtle change within herself. It wasn't just that Michael had seen her most vulnerable side and still looked at her with the same respect as always. It was that, for the first time, she had allowed someone to be present during her weakest moment and discovered that this didn't diminish her, but made her more complete. In the days that followed, as they repaired the physical damage caused by the storm, Sarah noticed other changes in herself. She no longer carefully measured each word before speaking to Michael, fearing to show too much. She cried openly when she was sad, laughed without restraint when something made her happy, expressed frustration when things didn't go according to plan. "You're different," Emily commented one afternoon as they sorted olives for the next pressing. "There's something about you that has freed itself." Sarah smiled, considering the observation. "I think I finally understood that being strong doesn't mean not having fear or weakness," she replied. "It means having someone who stays by your side exactly when you're at your worst moment." This personal revelation coincided with a turning point for the farm. The first commercial-scale production of their premium oil was ready, bottled in elegant ceramic containers designed by Emily, each with a label that briefly narrated the centuries-old history of the place. The day they loaded the first significant shipment destined for gourmet shops in San Francisco and New York, the three stood watching as the truck moved away along the dirt road, taking with it months of work, sacrifice, and hope. "Whatever happens," said Michael, his arm around Sarah's shoulders, "we've already won." And Sarah knew he was referring not just to the oil, the farm, or economic survival, but to something much more valuable: They had discovered that storms, both meteorological and emotional, could be devastating but also regenerating. After them, the earth remained clean, ready for new beginnings. That night, under a star-studded sky with a clarity only seen after great rains, Sarah watched Michael sleep beside her. For the first time since their marriage, she didn't feel she was playing an assigned role or fulfilling an external expectation. She was exactly where she wanted to be, with exactly whom she wanted to be with, building exactly the life she had chosen. In his hands calloused by work, in the small wrinkles beginning to form at the corners of his eyes, in the way his breathing synchronized with hers, even in dreams, Sarah recognized something that had been growing silently for months. An authentic love, built day by day, decision by decision, storm by storm. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of that certainty. The months passed with the cyclical naturalness characteristic of the countryside, where time isn't measured in hours and minutes, but in natural cycles. The winter harvest gave way to spring pruning, the fields briefly covered with wildflowers that then yielded to the relentless advance of the California summer. The Miller olive palm oil was beginning to gain recognition in specialized circles, appearing on the menus of award-winning restaurants and in gourmet shops in major American cities. Emily, who had arrived devastated on a night of emotional turmoil, was slowly blossoming like the plants in the garden she now tended with devotion. Her presence, initially conceived as temporary, had integrated into the farm routine so organically that it became difficult to remember what life was like before her. It was during an ordinary breakfast in the sunny kitchen, with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and warm muffins floating in the air, when Emily dropped the news that would once again change the dynamics of their improvised family. "I've been offered a job in Los Angeles," she announced, her eyes bright with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "A contemporary art gallery is looking for someone to manage their social media and organize events." They saw my designs for the oil labels. The silence that followed contained contradictory emotions: genuine joy for this opportunity, anticipated sadness for the imminent separation, pride for Emily's rebirth, unease at the approaching change. "That's wonderful," Sarah finally said, finding the smile she knew her friend needed to see. "It's exactly the kind of work you've always wanted. It wouldn't have happened without you two," Emily replied, extending her hands to take Sarah's and Michael's across the table. "You gave me more than a roof when I needed it. You gave me back faith in myself." The preparations for Emily's departure transpired in a bittersweet atmosphere. Sarah helped her organize her scarce clothes, adding pieces of her own that she no longer used or considered more suitable for the urban life Emily would face. Michael personally repaired the old leather suitcase that had belonged to his father, reinforcing seams and adding a waterproof lining. On the eve of her departure, the three remained awake until dawn on the porch, where the white walls reflected the silvery moonlight. They shared local wine, recalled amusing moments of their cohabitation, made plans for future visits, imagined what Emily's new life would be like in the big city. "I'm afraid," she confessed, when the wine bottle was almost empty and the stars began to pale before the first hint of dawn. "What if I'm not good enough? What if the city swallows me?" Sarah, seated beside her on the wooden bench worn by generations, took her hand. "Fear is natural when we're about to fly," she said, surprising herself with a wisdom she didn't know she possessed. "But remember, your wings have already endured worse storms." Michael nodded, adding with his particular mixture of practicality and poetry, "And you'll always have this nest to return to when you need to rest or remember who you are." Emily's departure left a tangible void in the farm. The room next to the kitchen, stripped of her belongings, seemed larger and more silent. Meals transpired without the spark of her witty observations. The nights missed the sound of the guitar and her clear voice singing old folk songs. But the most significant transformation occurred in the dynamics between Sarah and Michael. The presence of a third person had created, without their conscious awareness, a certain balance, an external witness to their evolution as a couple. Now alone again, but different from who they had been before Emily's arrival, they needed to rediscover each other. "It's strange," Sarah commented one night as they dined on the porch, under a sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. "The house seems emptier, but we seem fuller." Michael looked at her over his wine glass, his eyes reflecting understanding of what she was trying to express. "Helping someone heal has healed us too," he replied. As if by showing Emily the way back to herself, we found parts of ourselves we didn't know were lost. Emily's letters and calls from Los Angeles brought fragments of a life in full metamorphosis, enthusiastic descriptions of her shared apartment in the Silver Lake neighborhood, anecdotes about the eccentric artists who frequented the gallery, confessions about how much she missed the silence of the countryside and Sarah's freshly baked bread. It was during one of these calls when Emily casually mentioned something that sowed an unexpected seed. "One of the artists I work with does workshops for children from vulnerable neighborhoods," she commented. "He teaches them to express themselves through art, and it's incredible to see how they flourish when someone gives them space and creative tools." After hanging up, Sarah remained thoughtful, her mind connecting this information with something that had been silently gestating within her. "Have you ever thought about what this place would be like full of children?" she asked Michael that night, as they watched the stars from the old swing he had recently repaired. He didn't seem surprised by it, as if he too had been considering similar. "Sometimes I imagine children's laughter among the small hands learning to distinguish when an olive is at its perfect point," he confessed. "But I never knew if you—" The conversation that followed was one of the deepest. They talked about possible futures, old dreams that could now be reconsidered, fears of the unknown, and yearnings for what did not yet exist. When Mrs. Davis came for lunch the following Sunday, as was her weekly custom, Sarah and Michael decided to share with her an idea that had emerged from those nocturnal conversations. "We're thinking of opening part of the farm to receive groups of children from the city," explained Sarah as she served the beef stew that Mrs. Davis had prepared. "To teach them about traditional agriculture, about nature's cycles, about life in the countryside." Mrs. Davis's reaction surprised them both. Her eyes, usually serene, lit up with a youthful enthusiasm. She set her cutlery aside and took Sarah's hands in her own, weathered by decades of work. "I've been dreaming of something like this for years," she confessed, her voice slightly trembling with emotion. "To see today's children connect with the earth as we did, before phones and screens, to teach them where their food really comes from." What had begun as a vague idea transformed, with Mrs. Davis's blessing and enthusiasm, into a concrete project. During the following weeks, the three spent hours planning the transformation of a section of the farm into an educational space. Simple but welcoming dormitories for small groups, an open classroom with a view of the mountains, a community kitchen where children could learn to prepare traditional recipes with products they themselves would harvest. Construction began with the first significant profits from the premium olive oil. Each detail was carefully considered: colorfully hand-painted tiles for the walls, climbing vines that would attract butterflies and hummingbirds, a small garden divided into sections so each child could care for their own space. The work was exhausting, but there was a new joy in it. They were no longer working just to survive or prosper economically. They were building something that would transcend their own lives, that would connect generations, that would preserve knowledge at risk of extinction in a world increasingly disconnected from its natural roots. During this period, something definitively changed in the relationship between Sarah and Michael. The nocturnal conversations no longer primarily dealt with problems to solve or crises to overcome, but with shared dreams, with the legacy they wanted to leave, with the vision of a future they were actively building together. One night, as they returned home after supervising the progress on the educational space construction, Michael took Sarah's hand with a familiarity that spoke of shared years. "Do you know what I thought the first time I saw you?" he asked, his voice mingling with the nocturnal chorus of crickets. "That I was too young and too quiet," she replied with a smile, repeating what he had confessed to her months before. "Yes, but I also thought, this woman has entire worlds inside her that no one has bothered to explore," he continued, stopping to look at her under the silvery light of the full moon. "And each day I discover new corners of those worlds." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from embarrassment but from the intensity of the recognition. Being truly seen, not as the person others expected her to be, but as who she really was, with all her complexities and contradictions, was the most valuable gift she had ever received. That night, under the same roof that had witnessed their first conversation as strangers obligated by circumstances, they made love, not with the frenzied passion of those who fear the moment might pass, but with the deep intimacy of those who know They are building something that will last longer than themselves. And as the farm slept under the star-studded mantle of the California night, Sarah understood that Emily hadn't been the only one to receive wings during her stay. They had all learned to fly, each in their own way, each toward their own horizon, but always with the certainty of having a place to return to. The first group of children arrived on a luminous spring morning. The school bus appeared on the dirt road, raising a cloud of reddish dust that illuminated like gold in the morning sun. Sarah waited by the newly painted entrance of the farm, with a knot of nerves and excitement in her stomach that she hadn't felt since her wedding night. 20 childish faces, between 8 and 10 years old, most of whom had never been in a rural environment. They descended from the bus with a mixture of excitement and apprehension, their urban eyes dazzled by the amplitude of the horizon, by the silence interrupted only by birdsong, by the intense aroma of rosemary and thyme that the wind brought from nearby hills. "Welcome to Miller Olive Farm," Sarah greeted them, surprising herself with the warmth and confidence in her voice. "During this week, this will be your home, and all the secrets of the earth will be yours to discover." Michael and Mrs. Davis observed from a discreet background, allowing Sarah to occupy the center of this dream that, after all, had been primarily hers. The shy woman who had entered that arranged marriage just 2 years ago was now unrecognizable in this other woman who gestured animatedly as she explained the activity program to the children, answered their questions with infinite patience, and guided them to the dormitories where they would leave their belongings. The following days passed in a whirlwind of carefully planned activities. The children learned to recognize different varieties of olive trees by the shape of their leaves, to identify aromatic herbs by their smell, to distinguish between the songs of different local birds. They planted seeds in the community garden, kneaded bread in the outdoor kitchen under Mrs. Davis's supervision, helped Michael repair a section of the perimeter fence, learning the value of teamwork. Sarah discovered she had a natural talent for teaching, especially to the most reserved or difficult children. Her infinite patience, which she once considered a weakness, turned out to be exactly what these little ones needed. She knew when to gently press and when to give space, when to offer words of encouragement, and when to simply accompany in silence a process of discovery. Among all the children, there was one in particular who captured Sarah's heart from the first day. Lily, an exceptionally shy 9-year-old girl, always remained on the margins of group activities, observing with large, frightened eyes, but never voluntarily participating. The accompanying teachers explained that she barely spoke in class, and they had considered not bringing her to this experience, fearing that the change of environment would be too stressful for her. "She reminds me of someone I knew long ago," Sarah commented to Michael that night, as they evaluated the progress of the first day. Someone who believed her voice didn't deserve to be heard. During the following days, Sarah dedicated special attention to Lily. She assigned her an exclusive small garden bed, a sunny but protected corner where they planted basil, rosemary, and thyme together. She didn't demand conversation, simply narrated what they were doing, explained the properties of each plant, shared small stories about her own childhood in that same farm. Little by little, the girl began to relax in her presence. On the third day, Sarah surprised her speaking softly to the plants as she watered them, as if telling them secrets. On the fourth day, Lily asked her a question about why some basil leaves had more wavy edges than others. Small daily miracles that Sarah treasured without making a fuss about them. On the last day of the stay, they organized a small procession to a nearby chapel. The children walked in line on the path between olive groves, carrying small offerings of wildflowers and garden products to place on the altar of the small white chapel. It was during this walk that the moment occurred that Sarah would forever keep in her memory. Lily, who until then had advanced in silent isolation, suddenly ran to her with unusual excitement. "Mrs. Miller, look!" she exclaimed, her voice clear and firm for the first time. "The butterflies are coming to my herbs." Indeed, several brightly colored butterflies fluttered around the small bouquet of aromatic herbs that Lily carried as an offering. The girl observed them with reverential awe, as if witnessing the most extraordinary of miracles. "It's because you cared for those plants with love," replied Sarah, kneeling to be at her eye level. "Things grow better when we treat them with care, Lily. Plants, animals, and people too." The look the girl then directed at her was full of an understanding that transcended her age, As if in that moment, a mutual recognition established itself between similar souls who had found their voice in a late but powerful way. At the end of that first educational week, as the bus moved away carrying the children who had filled the farm with laughter, endless questions and overflowing energy, Sarah found herself crying openly. They weren't tears of sadness, but of a deep realization. She had spent her entire life preparing for this without knowing it. That night, seated on the porch under a star-filled sky, Sarah, Michael and Mrs. Davis evaluated the experience while sharing a local wine. "I always thought the children would come to learn from us," reflected Sarah, her voice soft in the penumbra. "But I think I learned as much or more from them." "That's true teaching," Mrs. Davis nodded, her eyes bright in the golden light of the oil lamps. "A perfect circle where everyone gives and everyone receives." Michael, who had observed Sarah throughout the week with a mixture of admiration and pride, added, "Seeing those children discovering the world we love was like seeing it ourselves for the first time." The following weeks brought more groups, children of different ages and backgrounds, each with their particularities and needs. The educational project gained recognition in pedagogical circles of the region, attracting the attention of increasingly distant schools. But not everything was harmony and growth. In a small town, where traditions weigh as much as the centuries-old stones of its streets, innovation is rarely received without resistance. Rumors began to circulate that the farm didn't comply with the necessary safety regulations to house minors, that the activities were inappropriate, that the children returned with ideas too modern about agriculture and sustainability. The origin of these rumors was soon revealed. The Thompson family, owners of the largest rural hotel in the region, saw in the educational project an unwanted competition. Their establishment, traditionally the only one that received organized visits in the region, was beginning to notice the impact of Miller Olive Farm on its clientele. The situation escalated when Sarah was summoned to the town hall to respond to concerns expressed by respectable members of the community. The small meeting room of the municipal building, with its solemn portraits of past mayors and its smell of old paper and waxed wood, became the scene of a barely disguised interrogation. "We understand your enthusiasm, Mrs. Davis," said the mayor, an affable man but clearly under pressure, "but there are procedures that must be followed, certifications that must be obtained. The safety of children is paramount." Sarah, who had meticulously prepared all the necessary documentation, responded with a calmness that surprised even Michael, present as moral support. "We completely agree, Mr. Mayor. That's why we have complied with every legal requirement from day one," she explained, as she unfolded organized folders with permits, inspections, and certifications. "Our project not only complies with current regulations, but in many aspects exceeds them." The meeting went on for hours, with technical objections that Sarah and Michael systematically refuted. The emotional cost was high, sleepless nights preparing responses to unfounded accusations, the constant tension of knowing they were being observed and judged, moments of doubt when they questioned whether the project was worth such wear and tear. "Maybe we should focus just on the oil," Sarah suggested one night, particularly discouraged after discovering that someone had spread rumors among the parents of a scheduled group, causing several cancellations. "It's already working well, it's less complicated." Michael, who rarely showed anger, responded with unusual intensity. "And let those who want to keep us all looking to the past win. Give up what you've built out of fear of those who can't imagine anything new." Resolution came unexpectedly during a public assembly convened at the town church to discuss educational activities in the community. What the Thompsons had planned as a forum to consolidate opposition to the farm transformed into something completely different. One by one, parents of children who had already visited Miller Olive Farm stood up to share testimonies. The daughter who now ate vegetables she previously refused because she knew how they grew. The son with behavior problems who had found peace working with his hands in the soil. The girl with learning difficulties who had written her first complete composition describing her experience in the olive grove. Lily's teacher, the shy girl from the first visit, related with contained emotion how the child who barely spoke in class now led a school project about aromatic herbs. "I don't know what magic happened in that farm," concluded the educator, "but that girl returned with a voice we didn't know she had." The final testimony came from the local pastor, Father Robert, a man respected by all factions of the town. With the moral authority that his 80 years and his dedication to the community conferred on him, he addressed the assembly. "I have visited Miller Olive Farm several times in recent months," he declared, "and what I've seen there is exactly what our community needs, a bridge between our most valuable traditions and a future where young people return to valuing the land and honest work. The essence of country life has always been cooperation, not competition. There is room for all who work with integrity." The victory wasn't immediate or complete. The rumors would persist, though with less force. The tensions with the Thompson family wouldn't disappear, though they would gradually transform into a cautious coexistence. But something fundamental had changed. The community, which initially observed with skepticism, now embraced the project as a symbol of renewal. That night, as Sarah and Michael returned home under a starry sky, they shared a complicit silence full of meaning. The scars of the battle just fought were visible but not defining. Like the century-old olive trees that survived droughts, storms, and plagues, they too had learned to bend without breaking, to resist without hardening, to grow through adversities and not despite them. And on that familiar path they had traveled so many times, under the same stars that had guided generations before them, both felt the deep certainty of being exactly where they should be, doing exactly what they should do, together exactly as they should be. The seasons passed with the cadence characteristic of the countryside, where time isn't measured in hours and minutes, but in natural cycles. The spring blossom of magnolias announcing winter's end, the swallows returning with spring, the cicadas marking summer's peak, the first autumn rain washing the dust accumulated on the silver leaves of the olive trees. Miller Olive Farm had found its own rhythm, a balance between its different facets. The production of premium olive oil that now appeared in specialized shops in several American cities, the educational project that regularly received school groups and had expanded to include workshops for families during weekends, and Sarah and Michael's personal life, which evolved with the same patient constancy that characterized everything they did. It was Emily who, during one of her visits from Los Angeles, verbalized what many thought when observing them. "It's as if you've lived together your entire lives," she commented one afternoon, as the three enjoyed tomato soup on the porch. "There's something about the way you move through space, as if you could predict exactly where the other will be." Sarah and Michael exchanged a complicit look. It was true. They had developed that silent synchrony of those who share not just a roof, but a purpose and a vision. They knew how to interpret each other's silences, to recognize needs before they were expressed, to anticipate reactions and offer support precisely when it was needed. Emily's visit coincided with preparations for a special celebration. It had been 2 years since that arranged marriage that had united their destinies. 2 years that seemed simultaneously shorter and longer, as if time expanded and contracted, according to the intensity of what was lived. "We should do something special," suggested Emily, always enthusiastic. "A party to celebrate everything you've built." Sarah, who still preferred intimacy to large social gatherings, responded with a tranquil smile. "Maybe something small, just with the people who really matter." And so, with the same simplicity that characterized their important decisions, they organized an intimate celebration in the farm's courtyard. Mrs. Davis, of course, who had been both mentor and second mother to Sarah. Father Robert, the parish priest who had defended them when rumors threatened their project. The workers who had remained faithful during difficult times, now an essential part of the farm's extended family. And some children from previous groups who had established special connections with the place, including Lily, the shy girl who now regularly visited with her family to care for the herb garden she considered her own. The celebration was simple but deeply significant. Long tables under the stars, illuminated with artisan lanterns, dishes prepared with products from the land, including olives from their own harvest, and bread baked according to century-old recipes. Traditional music played by local musicians, including a blind violinist who knew almost forgotten melodies. At midnight, when the celebration was at its most animated, Michael took Sarah's hand and discreetly guided her toward the olive groves. The full moon bathed the century-old trees in a silvery light that gave them an almost mystical appearance, like wise elders frozen in the midst of an ancient dance. "I wanted to be alone with you for a moment," he explained, as they walked among rows of olive trees, their elongated shadows drawing complex patterns on the reddish earth. to remember how it all began. They stopped under the farm's oldest olive tree, a twisted giant that, according to family tradition, had been planted by Sarah's great-grandfather. Its knotty branches extended like protective arms over them, and its trunk, furrowed by time, seemed to tell stories of past generations. 2 years ago, Michael began, his voice mingling with the distant song of crickets, I entered a room where a woman I barely knew awaited me, to whom I had been married by a family agreement. I was terrified. Sarah smiled, surprised by the confession. You, terrified? You seemed so sure, so calm. Because you looked even more frightened than I was, he replied with a soft laugh. And something inside me wanted to protect you, even before really knowing you. The silence that followed was full of meaning, the kind that doesn't need words to be understood. The night breeze gently swayed the silver leaves above them, creating a whisper that sounded almost like ancestral voices approving what was happening beneath their branches. I have something for you, Michael finally said, taking from his jacket pocket a small object wrapped in a silk handkerchief. It's not much, but it has meaning. Sarah carefully unwrapped the handkerchief to reveal a simple but elegant silver ring. Inside, engraved in delicate calligraphy, a date. The day they had together made the decision to reject the investor's offer and bet on their own vision for the farm. That day, Michael explained as he slid the ring onto Sarah's finger, we truly married. Not out of duty or convenience, but by choice. Sarah observed how the silver gleamed under the moonlight, a tangible symbol of the path traversed. The tears that came to her eyes weren't of sadness or passing emotion, but of a deep recognition. The perfect circle that ring represented was also the circle they had completed together, from strangers united by circumstances to companions united by conscious choice. I have something for you too, she said, bringing her hand to her dress pocket. Although I didn't plan it for tonight. The object she extracted was small and seemingly insignificant. An old key, the kind no longer manufactured, with an ornate design that spoke of another era. It's the key to my grandfather's office, she explained. The place where he kept his journals, his secrets, his dreams. No one has entered there since he died 15 years ago. Not even I dared. Michael took the key with reverence, understanding the symbolic weight of the gesture. Why now? Because I think it's time to open closed spaces, she replied, her voice firm despite the emotion. To connect the past with the future we're building. That night, under the ancestral olive tree that had witnessed generations of joys and sorrows, Sarah and Michael sealed their union not with formal vows or grandiose promises, but with the simple honesty of two people who had learned that true love isn't an ephemeral feeling, but a daily decision, a constant construction, a shared path. When they returned to the celebration, no one commented on their temporary absence, though Emily directed them a knowing look that said she knew everything. The party continued until the first lights of dawn began to tinge the horizon with pink and orange, announcing the start of a new day, of a new year in their shared journey. The following days brought with them the opening of that office closed for so long. The space, small but luminous, contained incalculable treasures. Detailed diaries on agricultural cycles dating back 5 generations, correspondence with farmers from other regions exchanging knowledge, sketches of irrigation systems inspired by ancient Native American techniques, philosophical reflections on man's relationship with the land. Sarah and Michael spent hours exploring those documents, discovering that many of the innovative ideas they had implemented had roots in forgotten practices that Sarah's grandfather had meticulously documented. It's as if he left a map for us, Michael commented one night, as they reviewed a particularly interesting notebook on sustainable pruning techniques. As if somehow he knew that someday someone would need this knowledge. Sarah nodded, feeling a deep connection with that ancestor she had barely known, but whose wisdom now guided their steps. Roots always remain, she replied, passing her fingers over the precise calligraphy that filled the yellowed pages, even when we can't see them. Inspired by those discoveries, Sarah and Michael decided to incorporate into the educational project an additional dimension: the preservation and transmission of traditional agricultural knowledge that was at risk of being lost in the era of industrialized agriculture. They created a small museum in one of the farm's dependencies, where they exhibited ancient tools along with explanations of their use. They organized workshops for local farmers, interested in sustainable techniques. They began to systematically document the knowledge of the town's elders, creating an oral archive that captured centuries of practical wisdom. The echo of roots manifested not only in these external projects, but also in their personal relationship. Sarah, observing Michael one morning as they had breakfast on the porch, noticed how he had unconsciously adopted gestures characteristic of her grandfather. The way he broke bread, how he slightly tilted his head when listening attentively, the way his hands always seemed ready to work even in moments of rest. "You would have liked him," she said, smiling at Michael's questioning look. "My grandfather. And I think he would have immediately approved of you." Michael smiled, understanding the deep meaning of that seemingly casual comment. In a world where connections were becoming increasingly superficial and ephemeral, they had chosen to honor depth, permanence, continuity between generations. And in that ancestral farm, under olive trees that had seen empires and revolutions pass, two people who had found each other through circumstances beyond their control discovered day by day that sometimes destiny has a wisdom that only reveals itself with time. The silver ring on Sarah's finger and the old key that Michael now wore on a cord around his neck were tangible symbols of something intangible but infinitely more valuable, the certainty of having found, amid imposed decisions and unexpected paths, exactly where and with whom they should be. With the dawn of the third year, Miller Olive Farm had completely transformed. What began as a property on the verge of ruin was now a vibrant ecosystem where tradition and innovation harmoniously coexisted. Premium olive oil production had found a stable niche in international markets. The educational project attracted school groups from increasingly distant states, and the small museum of traditional agriculture was beginning to be mentioned in specialized tourist guides. It was in this atmosphere of relative stability when an unexpected letter arrived. The sender, a prestigious agricultural university in Davis, expressed interest in the farm's unique approach to integrating ancestral practices with modern sustainable techniques. They proposed a collaboration. The farm would receive students for internships, and in exchange, Sarah and Michael would be invited as visiting professors to share their experience. "It's an extraordinary opportunity," commented Mrs. Davis when they consulted her opinion during one of their Sunday lunches. "You could influence an entire generation of future farmers." Michael, always pragmatic, pointed out the logistical challenges. "It would mean entire days away from the farm. We would have to completely reorganize our responsibilities, find trustworthy people who could supervise in our absence." Sarah listened to these practical considerations while her mind explored broader horizons. The idea of sharing what they had learned, of extending the farm's influence beyond its physical limits, resonated deeply with her. "I think we should try," she finally said, "not just for us, but for everything this place represents." The following months were of intense preparation. The arrival of the first university students brought renewed energy to the farm. Young people from diverse backgrounds, with rigorous scientific training but hungry for practical knowledge not found in textbooks, traversed the olive groves with curious eyes and open minds. Sarah discovered an unexpected talent for formal teaching. Her explanations, always anchored in direct experience, combined technical rigor with personal anecdotes that made knowledge accessible and memorable. Students followed her around the farm like chicks following a hen, absorbing not just information, but also a philosophy of respect for the earth and its cycles. Michael, initially more reserved in his educator role, found his own teaching style, practical, direct, based on demonstrations rather than explanations. His hands, calloused by years of work, showed with precision how to determine the exact moment for pruning, how to detect diseases in early stages, how to predict climate changes by observing the behavior of plants and insects. The first visit to the university as invited professors brought with it a significant discovery for Sarah. Standing before an auditorium full of students and professors, she felt not the paralyzing terror she expected, but a surprising calm. Her voice, which for years she had kept low out of insecurity, now filled the space with quiet authority. She spoke about what she intimately knew, about the land she loved, about knowledge she had absorbed with every pore of her being. "I've never seen you like that," Michael commented during the return journey, as the California landscape slid by the train windows. "You were shining." Sarah smiled, recognizing the truth in his words. Something had fundamentally changed in her. She no longer feared being visible, being heard, occupying space in the world. This new dimension of their lives brought with it unexpected challenges. The farm's increased visibility attracted commercial offers they had to carefully evaluate. Proposals to write books, participate in documentaries, license their brand for derivative products. Each decision required balancing growth opportunities with the integrity of their original vision. Amid this expansion, Sarah and Michael kept firmly anchored the center of their life, the relationship they had built day by day, decision by decision. They had developed their own rituals that protected their connection amid growing responsibilities. Shared breakfasts at dawn before the farm awakened, nocturnal walks among the olive trees under the same stars that had guided generations before them, deep conversations about dreams, fears, and hopes. One afternoon, while supervising autumn pruning in one of the oldest sectors of the olive grove, Sarah noticed something unusual on a particularly venerable tree. On its twisted trunk, almost hidden among bark wrinkled by centuries of sun and wind, appeared a small wildflower, delicate but tenacious, growing directly from the wood. "Look at that," she said, pointing out the phenomenon to Michael. Life finding a way in the most improbable place. He observed the flower with attention, his face reflecting a deep understanding of the unexpressed metaphor. "Like us," he replied simply, taking her hand. That night, seated on the porch under a star-studded sky, they discussed a possibility that had been silently maturing between them for months, the idea of expanding their family. "It wouldn't be easy," reflected Sarah. "With everything we have going on, with our commitments at the university, with the groups we constantly receive, nothing we've done until now has been easy," Michael replied with a tranquil smile. "And yet, here we are." The conversation didn't reach a definitive conclusion that night, nor in the following ones. It was a planted seed that needed time to germinate, a possibility they would explore with the same deliberate patience with which they had built everything else in their lives. Meanwhile, Emily continued thriving in Los Angeles. Her visits to the farm, though less frequent due to growing responsibilities, remained special occasions that everyone anticipated with joy. In her last stay, she had arrived accompanied. David, a Los Angeles artist with whom she shared not just life, but also creative vision. "I never thought I would find this," Emily had confessed to Sarah during an intimate conversation in the kitchen, while they prepared a special dinner together. "After James, I believed that part of me was broken." Sarah had embraced her friend, recognizing in her story an echo of her own, the surprise of discovering that the heart can heal and flourish again, sometimes in unexpected terrain. The expansion of horizons wasn't limited to personal or professional aspects. The discovery of the grandfather's diaries had awakened in Sarah an interest in exploring traditional agricultural techniques from other American regions. Together with Michael, she had begun to plan research trips to the south and northeast, seeking ancestral wisdom that could complement what was preserved in their own land. "Imagine what we could learn," she enthusiastically commented as they traced potential routes on maps spread across the dining room table. Places where traditional agriculture has been alive for centuries, where each family guards secrets transmitted for generations. Michael observed this new facet of Sarah with renewed admiration. The shy woman who barely raised her eyes during conversations was now a visionary who planned national expeditions, who dreamed of creating knowledge networks that would transcend boundaries. "Do you know what's most extraordinary?" he told her one night as they shared a local wine on the porch under a starry sky. "That with each step we take toward the new, we connect more deeply with the old. Each horizon we explore returns us to our roots." Sarah reflected on this paradox, recognizing its truth. The silver ring she now never removed from her finger gleamed under the moonlight, reminding her of the path traveled and the one still stretching before them. Their roots sink deeply into the earth, anchoring them firmly, but their branches continue growing, extending new leaves each spring, adapting to each season. And so, under the same sky that had witnessed civilizations rise and fall, in a land where time was measured in harvests more than in clocks, two people whom destiny had united through circumstances beyond their will continued writing a story that was simultaneously new and ancient, personal and universal, as unique as fingerprints and as common as the beating of the human heart. It's like the century-old olive trees, she finally replied. The farm, which had once been simply a property in danger of being lost, had transformed into a living symbol of resilience, adaptation, and growth. Its white walls, its century-old olive groves, and its rooms filled with children's laughter and academic conversations represented something greater than their physical components. They were the materialization of a shared vision, of a way of life that honored the past while embracing the future. And at the center of it all, like the heart that pumps blood to every extremity, was the relationship that Sarah and Michael had built day after day, choice after choice, storm after storm. New horizons opened before them, promising discoveries, challenges, and continuous growth. But each night it was the same ancestral stars that guided them back home, to the refuge they had created, not just with bricks and mortar, but with trust, respect, and a love that had flourished in the most unexpected place, like that wildflower on the trunk of the century-old olive tree. The news arrived on a luminous spring morning, when magnolias bloomed like pink clouds against the intensely blue sky. An official letter from the Department of Agriculture, Miller Olive Farm, had been selected to represent the United States in an international exhibition on sustainable agriculture to be held in Florence. "It's an extraordinary recognition," Sarah explained to Mrs. Davis, who had come for her Sunday lunch. "Not just for our olive oil, but for the entire educational project, for the preservation of traditional techniques, for the way we've integrated innovation with respect for the past." The news spread quickly through the town, generating a mixture of reactions. Pride among those who had supported the project from the beginning, poorly disguised resentment from the Thompsons and other families who continued to see the farm's success as an affront to traditional structures of local power, and renewed curiosity among those who had not yet visited a place that now reached international projection. Preparations for the exhibition added a new layer of complexity to the farm's already intense routine. Sarah and Michael dedicated hours to selecting materials that would adequately represent the essence of their work. Photographs documenting the educational project, samples of different varieties of olive oil, restored ancestral tools, reproductions of selected pages from the grandfather's diaries. It was during these preparations, amid the excitement for the opportunity that presented itself, when the unexpected shadow arrived. Michael began to feel a persistent pain in his right shoulder, which he initially attributed to the additional physical effort. When the pain extended to his arm and occasional episodes of numbness in his fingers began, Sarah insisted on a visit to the doctor. "It's probably inflammation from overexertion," he assured her, initially resisting. "It will pass with rest. Or it will worsen if you ignore it," she firmly replied. "No more discussion, we're going tomorrow." The diagnosis was more complex than anticipated, a cervical disc herniation that would require surgical intervention. The doctor, an experienced man with decades treating farmers in the region, was direct but compassionate. "It's not immediately urgent, but it can't be postponed indefinitely either," he explained. "The ideal would be to operate in the next 6 weeks. Recovery will take at least 3 months, during which he should significantly limit physical activity." The journey back to the farm transpired in a silence laden with unexpressed concerns. The Florence exhibition was scheduled for exactly 2 months later. Spring was a critical season in the olive grove, with essential tasks that couldn't be postponed. And the school groups already confirmed for the coming weeks represented commitments they had taken seriously. That night, seated on the porch where they had made so many important decisions, Sarah and Michael faced the situation with the direct honesty that characterized their relationship. "I can wait until after Florence for the operation," Michael proposed. "The pain is manageable with medication." Sarah firmly shook her head. "We won't risk your health for an exhibition, however prestigious it may be. There are other people who can represent us in Florence. There's no one who can replace you." The discussion that followed wasn't heated but deeply reflective. They evaluated options, considered alternatives, redefined priorities. And in the midst of this conversation, a clarity emerged that transcended the immediate situation. They had built something more resilient than themselves, a project that could temporarily sustain itself, even when one of its pillars needed repair. "We've created a team," Michael recognized, "people who share our vision, who know the farm's functioning almost as well as we do." "And we have Emily," Sarah added, an idea forming as she spoke. No one knows our story better. No one could represent us with more authenticity in Florence. The solution began to take shape. Michael would schedule his surgery for the following week, allowing the most intense phase of recovery to coincide with the period prior to the exhibition. Sarah would coordinate the participation from the United States, while the farm team, temporarily reinforced with advanced students from the Agricultural University, would manage daily operations. Emily, whose work at the art gallery gave her seasonal flexibility, would travel to Florence as the project's official representative. The following days were of frantic reorganization. Sarah showed a leadership capacity that surprised even those who knew her well. She delegated responsibilities carefully, considering the strengths of each team member, documented procedures they had, until then managed intuitively, and created communication systems to keep herself informed about every aspect of the farm. Michael, for his part, faced his own challenges. For someone whose identity was deeply tied to physical work, to the ability to solve problems with his own hands, the prospect of months of limitation represented more than a practical inconvenience. It was almost an existential crisis. "What if I can't work as before?" he confessed to Sarah the night before the surgery, giving voice to a fear that had been silently growing. "What if this is permanent?" Sarah, seated beside his bed in the aseptic and anonymous hospital room, took his hand in hers. The hands of both, weathered by years of work on the land, told similar stories of effort, dedication, and deep connection with the natural world. "Then we'll adapt," she replied with a serenity that emanated not from naivety, but from confidence gained through overcome challenges. "As we've done before, as we always will." The operation was technically successful, but the recovery proved more difficult than anticipated. The post-operative pain was intense. The forced immobility felt claustrophobic for someone accustomed to active days under the open sky, and the medication caused unpleasant side effects that altered sleep and appetite. Sarah divided her time between coordinating the farm, preparations for Florence, and caring for Michael. The nights became particularly challenging. He, restless from physical discomfort and mental worry, she, exhausted but determined not to show signs of fatigue that might increase his anxiety. It was Mrs. Davis who, with the sharp intuition that comes with age, intervened before the situation became unsustainable. One afternoon she appeared at the farm with small suitcases and announced she would stay until things stabilized. "You can't care for everyone and everything without rest, dear," she told Sarah with loving firmness, "and he needs to learn to accept help from more people, not just from you." Mrs. Davis's presence brought with it a necessary balance. With her characteristic mixture of pragmatism and compassion, she created routines that allowed Sarah to maintain her responsibilities while ensuring Michael received adequate attention. More importantly, her intervention broke the potentially destructive cycle, where Sarah exhausted herself trying to be indispensable and Michael blamed himself for being a burden. Meanwhile, Emily arrived from Los Angeles, bringing with her the renewing energy that always characterized her. She spent entire days absorbing information about every aspect of the project she would represent in Florence, taking detailed notes as Sarah explained particularities of the premium olive oil, educational philosophy, and preserved agricultural techniques. One afternoon, as they sorted materials for the exhibition on the large dining room table, Emily observed Sarah with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You're handling all this with incredible strength," she commented. "But I also see how tired you are. Who takes care of the caretaker?" The question touched something deep in Sarah, something she had been deliberately ignoring. The tears she had contained for weeks finally found release. They weren't tears of despair, but of relief. For the first time since the diagnosis, she allowed herself to recognize the magnitude of the challenge they faced. "I'm afraid," she confessed between sobs. "Not of the work or the responsibilities, but of not being strong enough for him when he needs me." Emily embraced her in silence, offering the simple consolation of presence. When Sarah finally calmed down, her friend spoke with the clarity that had always characterized their friendship. "The extraordinary thing about what you and Michael have built isn't that it's perfect or indestructible," she said. "That's that you've created something flexible enough to bend without breaking when storms arrive." In the days that followed, Sarah found a more sustainable balance. She learned to accept help without feeling she was failing. She discovered that sharing vulnerabilities, far from diminishing her leadership capacity, made her more accessible and effective, and she recognized that taking care of herself wasn't an optional luxury, but a fundamental necessity. Michael, for his part, experienced his own transformation. The forced immobility obliged him to develop aspects of himself that had remained secondary: his analytical capacity, his ability to teach and guide verbally, his patience to observe processes that before he would have physically intervened to accelerate. One morning, seated in the wheelchair he temporarily used to move around the farm, he observed from the porch's shade how a group of university students worked in the experimental nursery under Sarah's guidance. From this different perspective, something crystallized in his mind. What they had built together transcended the physical, the tangible, the immediate. It was a legacy that would continue evolving and growing even when they were no longer physically present to guide it. That night, he shared this revelation with Sarah as they dined on the porch under a starry sky. "I think I finally understand something fundamental," he said, his calm voice mingling with the nocturnal song of crickets. "What really matters isn't what we do with our hands, but what we plant in the minds and hearts of those around us." Sarah smiled, recognizing in his words an echo of her own recent reflections. "Like the century-old olive trees," she replied. "Their value isn't just in the olives they produce now, but in the future generations of trees that will grow from their seeds." Emily departed for Florence loaded not only with olive oil samples and educational materials, but also with personal stories that would bring the technical presentation to life. The exhibition resulted in a success that exceeded expectations. Miller Olive Farm received international recognition for its holistic approach that balanced tradition, innovation, and social responsibility. But the true triumph occurred silently on the farm itself. Day by day, Michael regained mobility and strength, though strictly following the limits imposed by doctors and physical therapists. Sarah found a new rhythm that allowed her to fulfill responsibilities without sacrificing her well-being, and together they rediscovered a fundamental truth: that shadows, however dark they seem, only exist where there is light. The experience had added a new dimension to their relationship. What began as a marriage of convenience evolved into a partnership by choice, and now deepened into a conscious interdependence where vulnerability wasn't weakness, but the ultimate proof of trust and connection. When Emily returned from Florence, she found a farm transformed not in its physical appearance, but in its atmosphere. There was a new serenity, a sense of renewed purpose that transcended external achievements or recognitions. "You've passed through fire and emerged stronger," she commented to Mrs. Davis, as they observed Sarah and Michael sharing a tranquil moment under the century-old olive tree that was their favorite refuge. The older woman nodded, her eyes shining with wisdom accumulated over decades. "That's how true love is forged, my dear. Not in days of sunshine, but in nights of storm. Not in moments of strength, but in those of shared fragility." And as the sun began to set over the olive groves that had witnessed so many lives, so many stories, so many beginnings and endings, Sarah and Michael remained seated in complicit silence, their intertwined hands communicating what words couldn't fully express: gratitude for the shared path, acceptance of shadows as an inevitable part of the landscape, and a deep certainty that the best was yet to come. Autumn arrived with its characteristic palette of golds and coppers, transforming the landscape into a vibrant canvas where the green olive trees stood out like eternal guardians against an intensely blue sky. Michael's recovery progressed with the same patient constancy that characterized the farm's natural cycles: gradual, sustained, respecting the necessary time for each stage. The doctors had been impressed with his progress. The physical therapist, a jovial woman who visited the farm 3 times a week, attributed the exceptional recovery not only to the rigorous discipline with which Michael followed the prescribed exercises, but also to the environment. "There's something healing about this place," she commented one afternoon, while observing her patient perform a series of movements that weeks before had been impossible. As if the air itself contained medicine. Sarah smiled, recognizing a truth she herself had experienced. The farm had been healing for both of them, each in their own way. For her, a space to find her voice after years of self-imposed silence. For him, an anchor that gave purpose and direction after decades of feeling adrift. The Florence exhibition had brought with it new opportunities they now had to carefully evaluate. International distributors showed interest in the premium olive oil. Educational institutions from various countries requested collaboration to replicate aspects of the pedagogical project. Publishers proposed books that would document the farm's experience as a model of sustainable agriculture and cultural preservation. "We can't embrace everything," Sarah acknowledged during a meeting of the expanded team that now collaborated in the farm's management. "We need to choose what will truly resonate with our central vision." This capacity to say no represented a significant evolution. Time ago, the need for economic survival would have made it tempting to accept any opportunity. Now, the hard-won stability allowed them to be selective, prioritizing quality over quantity, deep impact over superficial expansion. One afternoon, while Michael performed his rehabilitation exercises on the porch and Sarah sorted recent correspondence, an unexpected visitor arrived. The vehicle that stopped in front of the farm wasn't one of the usual ones, and the woman who descended from it, elegantly dressed with sophisticated simplicity, turned out to be a greater surprise. Jessica Winters, Michael's former girlfriend, whose appearance at the county fair years ago had provoked so many insecurities in Sarah. "I hope I'm not inopportune," said Jessica, as Sarah received her in the inner courtyard, where climbing vines created cascades of color on white walls. "I'm in the region for work, and felt I should stop by to say hello, after everything I've heard about the transformation of this place." There was a sincerity in her voice that would disarm even the most skeptical. Sarah, who years ago would have interpreted this visit as a threat, now received her with the quiet confidence of someone secure in her place in the world. Michael, upon seeing his former partner, showed initial surprise, quickly followed by a genuine but measured cordiality. There was no romantic tension in the reunion, but the mutual recognition between people who had shared a significant but definitely closed chapter of their lives. The conversation during the coffee that followed revealed that Jessica now directed a foundation dedicated to preserving traditional crafts in danger of extinction. Her work had taken her throughout the United States, documenting artisanal techniques, from Appalachian woodworking to Native American weaving. "What you're doing here with traditional agriculture is exactly the type of initiative our foundation seeks to support," she explained. "You're not just preserving techniques, but keeping them alive by adapting them to the present." The proposal that followed was as unexpected as the visit itself. The foundation offered funding to expand the farm's traditional agriculture museum, formally document the techniques preserved in the grandfather's diaries, and create an apprentice program that would allow local youth to acquire knowledge that conventional schools no longer transmitted. Sarah and Michael exchanged a complicit look, the type of silent communication they had perfected over the years. The offer was tempting, not just for the resources it would provide, but because it perfectly aligned with aspects of their vision they had had to postpone due to practical limitations. "It's a generous proposal," Sarah finally responded, "but we would need to discuss the details, ensure we maintain autonomy in implementation." "Of course," Jessica nodded. "We don't seek to impose an external vision, but to support what you've already demonstrated works." When Jessica departed, promising to send formal documentation about the proposal, Sarah and Michael remained in contemplative silence. There was a poetic symmetry in the situation. The woman who had once represented uncertainty for their nascent relationship now appeared as a potential catalyst for a new phase of growth. "Life has a peculiar sense of humor," Michael finally commented, his voice mingling with the whisper of the breeze through the leaves of the apple tree in the courtyard. "And an impeccable sense of timing," Sarah added, recognizing that this proposal arrived precisely when they were re-evaluating priorities after the transformative experience of recent months. The decision to collaborate with Jessica's foundation wasn't made precipitously. They consulted with the farm's expanded team, sought legal advice to adequately protect their autonomy, and finally accepted a modified version of the original proposal that guaranteed local control over all aspects of the program. This new initiative coincided with another significant development. After many reflective conversations, Sarah and Michael had decided to take the step toward parenthood. It wasn't an impulsive decision, but the ripe fruit of a process of individual and shared growth that had brought them to a point where they felt prepared to expand the circle of love they had created. The news of the pregnancy was received with overflowing joy by Mrs. Davis, who, after the initial expression of happiness, adopted a practical mode that made Sarah smile. "We'll have to adapt the house," she declared, mentally reviewing each space of the farm. "And reorganize responsibilities so you can rest adequately. The first trimester is fundamental." Emily, informed by video call from Los Angeles, screamed so loudly they had to move the phone away. Her enthusiasm was contagious even across technological distance. "I'll be the most incredible aunt any child has ever had," she promised, already making plans for frequent visits and creative gifts. The following months passed in a careful balance between preparation and continuity. Sarah's belly grew gradually, changing her physical center of gravity, while a parallel transformation occurred in her perception of time and purpose. Michael, now almost completely recovered, assumed additional responsibilities to protect her from excessive efforts, though Sarah insisted on remaining active within the limits recommended by doctors. The apprentice program financed by Jessica's foundation began to take shape. Young people from the town and neighboring villages, many descendants of farming families who had abandoned traditional practices in favor of industrialized methods, came to the farm for weekly sessions where Michael, now in a primarily educational role, transmitted knowledge preserved in the grandfather's diaries and enriched with his own experience. Sarah, meanwhile, concentrated on formally documenting these techniques, creating a multimedia archive that combined text, photographs, videos, and audio recordings. This project, which at other times would have been secondary, now acquired a special urgency. She was preserving not just for the farm's expanded community, but for the son or daughter growing inside her. One particularly luminous early winter afternoon, while supervising the installation of new display cases in the expanded museum, Sarah felt the baby's first movements. The sensation, like soft fluttering inside her, stopped her mid-sentence. Her hand flew instinctively to her rounded belly as a smile of wonder transformed her face. "Are you all right?" asked the young artisan installing the display cases, noticing her sudden stillness. "Better than all right," Sarah replied, her voice mixing emotion and reverence. "I just felt my baby moving for the first time." That night, in the intimacy of their bedroom, she guided Michael's hand so he could share the experience. The moment when he perceived that faint movement was etched in both their memories. The expression of absolute wonder on his face, weathered by sun and years, the unexpected tear that slid down his cheek without him trying to hide it, the silence laden with meaning that no words could have improved. As the pregnancy advanced, Sarah observed subtle changes in Michael. The man who had entered that arranged marriage seeking primarily companionship to mitigate his loneliness now radiated an almost palpable anticipation before imminent fatherhood. He spent hours adapting a room near theirs for the baby, personally restoring a cradle that had belonged to his own family for generations, consulting books on child development with the same seriousness he dedicated to agricultural treatises. "So I never thought I would have this opportunity," he confessed one night, as they worked together organizing tiny clothes in the newly painted closet. "At my age, I believed certain paths were definitely closed." Sarah took his hand, recognizing in his words an echo of her own feelings. Both had arrived at this point by unexpected routes, defying conventional expectations and chronologies. "Perhaps some things can only flourish when the ground is truly prepared," she replied, her voice soft in the room illuminated by the golden light of old lamps. Not before, not after, but exactly at their precise moment. The climax came on a spring night, when the fields were covered with wildflowers, and the air carried aromas of moist earth and renewed vegetation. The contractions began gradually while Sarah was reviewing correspondence in the office that had once belonged to her grandfather. At first, she ignored them, attributing them to the false alarms she had experienced in previous days. But when they established a recognizable pattern, she calmly called Michael, who was coordinating a group of apprentices in the northern sector of the olive grove. The hours that followed passed with the focused intensity that only truly transcendental moments can generate. The journey to the hospital in San Francisco, where they had decided to give birth on medical recommendation given Sarah's age, The calls to Mrs. Davis and Emily, who promised to arrive as soon as possible, the delivery room where Sarah found an inner strength that surprised even herself. Michael remained by her side at every moment, his presence simultaneously strong and vulnerable, as he witnessed the miracle and titanic effort of birth. When finally the girl, for it was a girl, arrived in the world with a vigorous cry that filled the room, both experienced a realization that transcended words. This was the most valuable fruit their union could ever produce. They named her Hope Elizabeth Davis, honoring both the emotion she represented and the woman who had been mentor and second mother to Sarah. When Mrs. Davis arrived at the hospital and held her namesake for the first time, the tears that ran down her wrinkled cheeks contained decades of stories, losses, and renewals. Emily, who had taken the first available flight from Los Angeles, arrived loaded with gifts too large for a newborn. Illustrated books they would save for future years, a miniature easel for when the little one could hold a brush, seeds of uncommon flowers to plant together, when Hope would be old enough to understand growth cycles. The days following the birth passed in a haze of intense emotions, physical challenges, and constant discoveries. Sarah, recovering from the delivery, experienced both deep exhaustion and an inexplicable energy that emerged precisely when she needed it most. Michael, facing this new dimension of responsibility, showed an adaptability that impressed everyone. One afternoon, while Hope slept in her newly inaugurated cradle and the house enjoyed a temporary quietness, Sarah and Michael found themselves alone for the first time since the birth. Seated on the porch where they had shared so many transcendental conversations, they contemplated the familiar landscape of olive groves and distant mountains with eyes that simultaneously saw the same as always and something completely new. "Do you remember our first night here?" Sarah asked, her voice soft so as not to disturb the peace of the moment. Two strangers obligated by circumstances, desperately trying to find something to talk about. Michael smiled, the memory vivid in his mind despite the time elapsed. "I was terrified," he confessed, "but I also felt something inexplicable, as if some part of me recognized that that uncomfortable moment was the beginning of something extraordinary." Sarah nodded, recognizing a similar truth in her own experience. She extended her hand to intertwine it with his, a gesture that now felt as natural as breathing, but that once had required conscious courage. "The path from then to here," she reflected, letting her gaze traverse the fields they had transformed together. "With all its obstacles, all its surprises, all its lessons, I wouldn't change a single step." Michael gently squeezed her hand, his response communicating total agreement without need for additional words. The sun began to descend toward the horizon, bathing everything in a golden light that seemed to bless every corner of the farm and its surroundings. And in that moment of perfect stillness, while Hope slept under the same roof that had witnessed generations of joys and sorrows, Sarah and Michael felt a deep certainty. What they had built together, their home, their project, their family, their love, was exactly what both had been searching for all their lives, even when they didn't have words to name it. The fruit of their unexpected union had completely ripened, revealing a sweetness that only time, patience, and constant care could produce. Dawn painted the sky with pink and golden tones when Sarah awoke. For a moment she remained motionless, listening to the familiar sounds of the farm coming to life, the rooster's distant crowing, the whisper of wind through olive trees, Michael's soft steps in the kitchen, preparing the first breakfast of the day, as he did every morning. Today wasn't an ordinary day. It marked exactly 5 years since that first night, when two strangers, united by an arranged marriage, had found themselves in this same bedroom, uncomfortable and nervous, unable to imagine the path they would travel together. Sarah rose silently so as not to wake Hope, who had developed the habit of slipping into her parents' bed in the early hours of dawn. The 3-year-old girl slept peacefully, her dark curls spread across the pillow, her breathing deep and regular, her small fingers clutching the worn, stuffed rabbit Emily had given her at birth. From the window, Sarah contemplated the farm stretching before her eyes. The verdant olive groves gleaming with morning dew, the restored buildings with their white walls shining under the nascent light, the new constructions that had expanded the educational project, the small museum that now attracted visitors from across the United States. All of it formed an image of harmony and purpose that dramatically contrasted with the place on the verge of collapse she had found years ago. Michael appeared in the doorway with 2 steaming cups of coffee. His face, marked by lines that spoke of years under the California sun, lit up with that smile that still accelerated Sarah's heart. "Happy anniversary," he said softly, handing her one of the cups. 5 years. 5 lives, she replied, accepting both the coffee and the gentle kiss that accompanied it. "Sometimes I feel we've lived several complete existences in this time." They sat on the small terrace adjacent to their bedroom, an intimate space they had created for moments like this. The silence between them was comfortable, the kind only built by years of honest communication and continuous presence. The day would unfold with the simple celebration they had planned, a special lunch with Mrs. Davis, Emily, and David, who had arrived from Los Angeles the night before, and the closest members of the expanded team that now operated the farm. They didn't want grand events or public recognitions, just the warmth of sharing with those who had been an integral part of their journey. As they finished their coffee in contemplative silence, they heard the unmistakable little steps of Hope approaching. The girl appeared in the doorway, rubbing her sleepy eyes, the stuffed rabbit dragged by one ear. "Is today the party?" she asked with a voice slightly hoarse from sleep. Sarah opened her arms, and the little one nestled in her lap, that warm and confident presence that represented everything good they had created together. "Yes, dear," she replied, kissing the top of her head where curls formed untamable swirls. "Today we celebrate when Daddy and Mommy began their story together." "The story of the prince and princess of the olive grove?" asked Hope, using the name she herself had given to the bedtime story they told her, a very simplified and child-appropriate version of their own history. Michael laughed softly, exchanging a complicit look with Sarah over their daughter's head. "Something like that," he replied. "Though neither of us was really a prince or princess." "Mommy was a princess," Hope insisted with the determination characteristic of her age, the princess of the olive grove who cared for magic plants. Sarah embraced her daughter, moved by this childish interpretation that, in a way, captured an emotional truth. She had indeed been someone with special gifts for making life flourish around her, though back then she didn't recognize that power as the strength it truly was. The morning passed in preparations for the celebration. Emily and David decorated the inner courtyard with garlands of wildflowers and artisan lanterns. Mrs. Davis, firm in her insistence on personally taking charge of the main menu, directed activities in the kitchen with the loving authority that characterized her. Michael and several apprentices prepared the long tables under the arbor covered with climbing vines, where lunch would be served if the spring weather remained favorable. Sarah, while supervising these preparations, found herself experiencing a peculiar sensation of déjà vu. It wasn't that this specific scene had repeated itself before, but that it contained echoes of so many significant moments lived in that same space. The night they decided to reject the investor's offer, the celebrations after the success of the first commercial production of olive oil, the welcomes to the first school groups, the improvised party when Emily announced her move to Los Angeles, the silent vigil during Michael's recovery, the presentation of hope to the community. This courtyard had witnessed profound transformations, not just of the farm as a physical entity, but of the people who inhabited it. The white walls, the terracotta floors worn by generations of footsteps, the pots of geraniums that renewed their flowering each spring, all seemed to contain memories of the moments that had shaped this unexpected but deeply satisfying present. At noon, when guests began to gather, Sarah briefly retired to the room that had once been her grandfather's office and now functioned as the project's archive. She needed a moment of quietude to process the intensity of the emotions that overwhelmed her. Seated in the worn leather armchair, where her grandfather had spent so many hours writing his agricultural diaries, Sarah reflected on the complete circles that life sometimes draws when we least expect them. She, who had entered that arranged marriage with fearful resignation, now headed an internationally recognized educational project. Michael, who had sought companionship to mitigate his loneliness, had found renewed purpose as a mentor and father figure. Both, who had begun as strangers obligated by external circumstances, had built an association so deep that sometimes they seemed to function as a single organism with two complementary expressions. A soft knock on the door interrupted her reflections. It was Lily, the shy girl from the first school group, now a self-confident teenager who actively participated in the apprentice program. "Everyone's waiting, Mrs. Davis," she announced with a smile. "Father Robert says he can't contain Mrs. Davis much longer before she starts serving." Sarah smiled, perfectly imagining the scene. Father Robert, as he was affectionately called at 85 years old, continued to be a regular presence at the farm, officiating as moral guardian and storyteller for the new generations. "Tell them I'm coming right away," she replied, rising from the armchair. "I just needed a moment." Lily nodded with an understanding that transcended her age. "Sometimes you need to take a deep breath before important things," she said, repeating a phrase that Sarah herself had taught her years ago, when planting seeds in a small garden bed represented an overwhelming challenge for a pathologically shy girl. When Sarah returned to the courtyard, she found it transformed into a scene of intimate but vibrant celebration. About 30 people occupied the tables arranged in a U-shape. Farm workers and their families, apprentices from the educational program, neighbors who had supported the project since its beginnings, close friends who had shared both moments of crisis and triumph. Michael awaited her in the center of the courtyard, Hope seated on his shoulders, both smiling upon seeing her appear. By his side, Mrs. Davis radiated with the characteristic pride of someone seeing their deepest hopes materialize. Emily and David, now officially engaged as they had announced the night before, shared that special luminosity of those beginning their own path, inspired by the witnessed example. As Sarah joined this chosen family, this circle of shared affection and purpose they had patiently created over the years, she felt a crystalline certainty. This was home, in the deepest sense of the word. Not simply a physical space, but an interweaving of relationships, stories, values, and visions that created roots as deep as those of the century-old olive trees surrounding the farm. Lunch proceeded with the characteristic warmth of gatherings, where each person present has a significant and recognized place. The traditional dishes prepared by Mrs. Davis, fresh tomato soup, roast lamb with herbs from the garden, homemade bread baked in the restored wood-fired oven, passed from hand to hand, while conversations flowed naturally between practical topics, shared memories, and future plans. When the moment for toasts arrived, it was Father Robert who spoke first, his voice weakened by years but still charged with moral authority. "When we celebrate an anniversary," he began, "we not only honor the past, but reaffirm our faith in the future. What Sarah and Michael have built here transcends their own lives. They have planted seeds that will continue bearing fruit long after all of us have departed." Emily followed with words that mixed humor and deep emotion. "As a witness from almost the beginning of this story, I can say that the most extraordinary thing isn't what they've achieved, which is impressive, but how they've achieved it, with integrity, with vision, and above all, with a love built every day, brick by brick, decision by decision." Other testimonies followed, each illuminating different facets of the transformation all had witnessed. Lily speaking with surprising eloquence about how the farm had taught her that being different wasn't a limitation, but a strength. One of the youngest apprentices describing how the program had reconnected his generation with cultural roots that were on the verge of being lost. An elderly woman from town recalling how the farm, which had once represented the traditional power of a few families, now functioned as a community center where all voices had value. When Michael's turn came, he took Sarah's hand before speaking. "5 years ago, I entered a room where a woman I barely knew awaited me," he began, his eyes fixed on hers. "I was convinced that at 40, I already knew everything important about myself and about life. How wrong I was." Soft laughter traversed the audience as Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Sarah taught me," Michael continued, "that it's never too late to reinvent oneself, that the most improbable beginnings can lead to the most perfect destinations. That true love isn't a lightning bolt that strikes you, but a seed you plant with care, water with patience, and protect with determination until it blossoms into something stronger and more beautiful than you could ever have imagined." When it was Sarah's turn, the words she had carefully thought seemed inadequate before the moment's emotionality. In their place, she opted for the honest simplicity she had come to value above eloquence. "I entered this marriage seeking to save a property," she said, "and in the process, I found my voice, my purpose, and a love that taught me that true strength lies in shared vulnerability. Thank you to everyone who has been part of this journey, but especially to you, Michael, for seeing in me what I myself couldn't see then. The celebration continued well into the afternoon, with traditional music played by local musicians, stories shared around the tables as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, and Hope's crystalline laughter as perfect counterpoint to more solemn conversations. When guests began to say goodbye, Sarah and Michael found a moment to discreetly escape. With Hope secure under the watchful care of Mrs. Davis and Emily, they walked together to the oldest olive grove on the farm, where the century-old tree that had witnessed generations extended its twisted branches like welcoming arms. Beneath those branches, 5 years ago, they had shared a crucial conversation that marked their transition from a marriage of convenience to a consciously chosen union. The silver ring Sarah never removed, and the old key Michael always carried with him, symbolized that moment of mutual recognition and renewed commitment. The setting sun bathed the landscape in golden and copper tones, creating an almost magical atmosphere as they stopped under the ancestral tree. Without need for words, they embraced, their bodies finding the familiar spaces created by years of physical and emotional proximity. "If you could go back," Michael asked, repeating a question Sarah had asked him years ago during the first months of their marriage, "would you choose this path again? With me?" Sarah raised her eyes to him, to this man who had entered her life through imposed circumstances, but who was now as integral a part of her identity as her own heart. "I wouldn't change a single step of the path," she replied with absolute certainty, "because each obstacle, each crisis, each moment of doubt brought us exactly here, and here is where we were always meant to be." And as the sun disappeared behind distant mountains, painting the sky with stripes of purple and orange, Sarah and Michael remained embraced under the century-old olive tree, their silhouettes merged into one against the flaming horizon. The circle was complete. What had begun as an agreement between families, a practical transaction to save ancestral lands, had transformed into a bond that transcended contracts and conveniences, a love built patiently on foundations of mutual respect, shared purpose, and daily conscious choice. In the farm, lights began to turn on as darkness gradually settled. Hope ran through the courtyard, chasing fireflies with Emily, their laughter mingling with the nocturnal song of crickets. Mrs. Davis supervised the final cleanup with the loving efficiency that characterized her. The last guest said goodbye, promising to return soon. And under the first stars of the night, Sarah and Michael undertook the journey back to the home they had built, not just with bricks and mortar, but with shared dreams, tireless work, and a love that had flourished in the most unexpected place, like that wildflower they once found growing directly from the trunk of a century-old olive tree, improbable, tenacious, and perfectly exactly where it was meant to be.